Chapter 1. The Contents of Brackenhurst Hall. The catalogue ran to 47 pages. Mrs. Agnes Ruddle had counted them, not because she was interested in the lots, but because counting was something to do with her hands, while the removal men carried Colonel Caldecott's armchair past the door where he had sat in it every evening for 31 years. The armchair was lot 84, 8 to 12 pounds, the catalogue said. Mrs. Ruddle thought that was about right for the chair and an insult to the man. Brackenhurst Hall stood 3 miles north of the market town of Wentford, at the end of a drive that had been handsome in 1910 and was now mostly gravel and optimism. The crocuses were out along the verge. They had no business being out in early March, and the frost that came each night said so plainly. But there they were all the same, yellow and purple, making the place look better than it deserved. The house itself was cold. It was always cold. The radiators in the east wing had given up entirely, and the boiler in the west wing was doing its best, and with the conviction of a man who knows he is losing. Francis Caldecott, the late Colonel's son, and the man now selling everything his father had accumulated over a long and not particularly interesting life, stood in the entrance hall at 10 minutes past 9 on the Thursday morning, and watched the preview visitors arrive. His expression was that of a person waiting for a bus that is already late. He was 44, Francis, and he had his father's chin and none of his father's patience. The patience had gone somewhere to the Colonel's sister's side of the family, and Francis had received instead a good eye for furniture, and an unfortunate habit of saying what he thought at the moment he thought it. The house would pay the death duties. The contents would pay the rest. He knew this, and he had made his peace with it. Mostly, 2 porters from Hobbs and Aldrich, the auctioneers, were stationed at the door with clipboards. A 3rd was in the library, keeping watch over the silver lots. The preview ran Thursday and Friday. The sale began Saturday morning at 10. By 9:30, 11 people had signed the visitors' register. Mrs. Ruddle, who had been housekeeper at Brackenhurst for 38 years and was staying on through the sale at Francis's request, because she knew where the light switches were, watched the 11 from the kitchen passage doorway. She knew a dealer when she saw one. They touched things differently from private buyers. A private buyer touched things to feel what they were. Dealer touched things to feel what they were worth. The distinction was clear to her as the difference between a tap and a knock. Mr. Gerald Petch arrived at 20 to 10, by which time 12 people had signed the register. He signed it Gerald R. Petch, London, in a hand that was larger than necessary, and he walked into the drawing room without waiting for the porter to show him through. He had a good dark overcoat and shoes that had been recently resoled, and he carried a small notebook in his breast pocket that he touched once. Man touches a wallet to check it is there. Mrs. Ruddle watched him go. She had seen his type before. She could not have said exactly where. A man who knew the price of everything in the room before he had looked at anything properly. She went back to the kitchen and put the kettle on. The 7th person to sign the register at 9:43 was a woman in a brown wool coat who wrote Mrs. D. Vane, Marlborough. She had a composed face and careful eyes, and she looked at the Dutch picture in the library for 4 minutes before she moved on to anything else. The porter noticed this only because he was bored. Woman the porter did not notice at all arrived at 10:15. She was old, smaller than you would expect a person to take up space. She wore a grey coat that had been good in about 1948. She signed the register as J. Marple, St. Mary Mead, and she gave her address in the small firm hand of someone who had written it a great many times. She had come, she explained to the porter, to look at the library lots. Specifically, lots 312 through 318, which were described in the catalogue as a collection of correspondence and personal papers, 19th and early 20th century, bound in 4 volumes. The porter pointed her toward the library. Miss Marple thanked him, adjusted her bag on her arm, and went where she was directed. She was not in any hurry. She had been at an estate auction preview before, more than once, and she knew that the important thing was not to appear to be looking at anything in particular. Crocuses outside the library window were catching the thin morning light. They would be dead by Sunday. March always got them eventually. Chapter 2. Mr. Petch makes himself known. The long case clock in the entrance hall was lot 12, estimated at 120 to 100 to 180 pounds. And Gerald Petch had been standing in front of it for 10 minutes when Francis Caldecott came through from the drawing room. "Fine piece," Petch said without turning round. "The case is right. Mahogany, good colour, crossbanding intact. Movement's been serviced recently. You can smell the oil. Though I'd want to look at the hood more carefully." He did turn round then. "The hood looks wrong to me." Francis Caldecott looked at him. "Francis Caldecott," he said. He did not offer his hand. "Petch. Gerald Petch. I dealt with your father twice, years ago. The Regency writing table in 1946, and a small watercolour collection in 1949. Pleasant man, your father. Didn't always take advice, but pleasant." "I remember the writing table," Francis said. "Good piece. I got a fair price." Petch turned back to the clock. "About the hood. The proportions are off by about 1.5 inches. Someone's married it to a different base at some point. Probably in the 20s, when these things were being broken up and reassembled. It happens. Nothing dishonest, just the history of furniture. But it does affect the value. I'd put it at 70 to 90, not the estimate." "Mr. Petch," Francis said, and his voice had taken on a quality that the porters, who were within earshot, would later describe to each other as very controlled. "The estimate was set by Hobbs and Aldrich, who have been auctioneers since 1887, and have had the piece independently examined. If you have views on the estimate, I suggest you raise them in the Sala room on Saturday." "I'm only telling you what I see," Petch said pleasantly. "I know exactly what you're doing," Francis said. He turned and walked back toward the drawing room. One of the porters looked at the ceiling. The other made a note on his clipboard, about nothing in particular. Petch watched him go, then took out his notebook and wrote something in it. Miss Iris Dunmore found him there 5 minutes later. She was 31, for the good posture of someone who had been told since childhood to stand straight, and she wore her dark hair pinned back in a way that was practical rather than becoming. She had a catalogue under her arm and a pen behind her ear. "He's offended," she said. "People who own things are always offended when you tell them what the things are worth," Petch said. "It's one of the constants of the trade." "What did you make of the silver lots?" "Mixed. The canteen is good, George III, all matching. The sauce boats are later and not the same quality. I'd concentrate on the canteen and leave the rest." "That's what I thought. Make a note. What else?" "There are 4 watercolours in the upstairs corridor that aren't in the catalogue. I asked the porter, and he said they were withdrawn. I think one of them might be a Cotman." Petch looked up from his notebook. "You're sure?" "No," I said might. "Go and look at it again. Take your time. Don't ask anyone anything." Iris Dunmore went. Petch put his notebook away and moved on to the furniture in the drawing room, which included a set of 6 Hepplewhite chairs that he thought were right, and a serpentine sideboard he wasn't sure about. Howard Tench came in from the hall at 11:30. He was 50, with a carefully trimmed grey moustache, and a way of carrying himself that suggested he had once been important somewhere, and still expected to be treated accordingly. He was here for the library, specifically the natural history books in lots 303 through 311, and he had driven up from Winchester. He and Petch saw each other across the drawing room. The recognition was mutual and immediate, and neither man showed any pleasure in it. Tench crossed to the serpentine sideboard and examined it with his back to Petch. Petch watched him for a moment, then moved to the far end of the room where a pair of pier glasses were standing. Mrs. Ruddle, coming through to ask if anyone wanted tea, noted the dynamic and said nothing. In her experience, when two men in the same room carefully avoided looking at each other, it was either a woman between them or money. Mostly money. She offered tea. Tench declined. Petch said he'd take a cup if it was no trouble. She brought it from the kitchen, on a tray with 3 biscuits, and Petch ate the biscuits and left the cup on the mantelpiece. When he moved on, which she thought was typical. Mrs. Dorothea Vane, who was in the library at this point, examining the furniture lots, heard the exchange through the open door but did not come out. She had seen Petch's name in the visitor's register when she signed her own. She had stood quite still for a moment, then written Mrs. D. Vane in her careful hand and moved on into the house. She had been waiting for this for a long time. It was not pleasant exactly, but it was necessary. She felt the way she imagined a surgeon felt before an operation he did not enjoy, but knew how to perform. She went back to the Dutch picture. Vander Hayden, she thought. Yes, still right. She had always had a good eye for it. Chapter 3. Blue Bedroom. The blue bedroom was at the end of the east corridor, past the point where the radiators gave up. It had been the Colonel's room until the last year of his life, when the stairs became too much, and the blue of the name came from the wallpaper. Faded Regency striped the colour of a winter sky. The bed had been removed for the sale and replaced with lots. A wardrobe, lot 147, chest of drawers, lot 148, a pair of bedside tables, lot 149 and 150, a washstand, lot 151, a small travelling case of tortoise shell and brass fittings, lot 152, that sat on top of the chest of drawers and looked somewhat out of place. Gerald Petch went up to the blue bedroom at 3:30 in the afternoon, when the preview crowd had thinned to 8 people, and the light from the east windows had gone flat and grey. He had looked at everything downstairs twice and made his notes. And he wanted to check the tortoiseshell case, which he had seen in the catalogue but not yet inspected. He had also at some point in the afternoon acquired a cigarette. He did not usually smoke cigarettes. He was a pipe man. But Howard Tench had left a packet on the side table in the drawing room when he went to the lavatory, and Petch, passing, had taken one from it on instinct, not from need but from habit. Things left unattended in a room had always attracted him. He put it in his breast pocket and forgot about it until he was on the stairs. The cigarette packet was not Tench's. Tench had not left it. The packet had appeared on the side table at 2:30, placed there by someone who had set it down casually among the preview clutter, between a jug without a handle, not in the catalogue, and a stack of old Country Life magazines, lot 201, job lot, 10 shillings. Anyone might have left it. Several people had been through the drawing room by then. Petch took the case from the chest of drawers and carried it to the window. Good piece. Original hinges. The brass work was not polished, which was correct. You did not want polished brass on a piece this age. He checked the interior. Silk lining intact, faint stain near the left-hand corner that was probably ink. He wrote the lot number and a figure in his notebook. He put the case back and stood for a moment at the window. The drive was visible from here, and a woman in a brown coat was walking toward the car park. He did not recognize her from this height and distance. He took the cigarette from his breast pocket and his lighter from his waistcoat. The cigarette was something to do. He smoked it slowly, standing at the window. At first there was nothing. Then, after perhaps 3 minutes, a numbness at the corner of his mouth that he took for the cold. He rubbed his jaw. The numbness spread to his tongue, oddly, in a way that tobacco did not usually produce. He frowned at the cigarette. Then his heart did something he had no word for. Not pain, not the crushing sensation he had heard described. A lurching, a stumbling, as if the mechanism had caught on something. He put his hand on the chest of drawers. The notebooks fell out of his breast pocket when he went down. He did not go down all at once. He went in stages. First to the chest of drawers, then to one knee, then fully, pulling the Country Life magazines from the windowsill as he went. The lighter landed under the wardrobe. The cigarette, still lit, came to rest between his right hand and the floor. He was dead before it had burned down another 1/4 inch. Thomas Beale, the junior porter, found him at 5:05. Beale was 18 and had never found anyone dead before. He stood in the doorway for a moment that felt much longer than it was, then went and told Mr. Aldrich, the senior partner from Hobbs and Aldrich, who was downstairs in the study going over the catalogue corrections. Mr. Aldrich telephoned the doctor. Dr. Fenwick arrived at 5:30, examined Petch where he lay, and noted the bluish tinge at the corner of the mouth, and the hand still loosely gripping the edge of the fallen magazines. He noted the cigarette stub. He noted the cold of the room. Gerald Petch was 58 years old and had been carrying, according to what Iris Dunmore told him in the corridor, in a very steady voice, some irregularity of the heart that he had declined to have properly investigated. The presentation was consistent. Cardiac arrest, Doctor, Fenwick said to Mr. Aldrich in the corridor. Nothing to suggest otherwise. Cold room, exertion, a man with a known tendency. I'll need to inform the coroner, of course, as a matter of procedure. Mr. Aldrich said yes, of course. What did this mean for the sale on Saturday? Dr. Fenwick said he imagined the sale could proceed. Iris Dunmore had not cried. She stood in the corridor, with her arms folded and her chin level, and answered the question she was asked. At 6:10, when the other preview visitors had been asked to leave, and the police constable had come and gone, and Frances Caldecott was making arrangements on the telephone, she went to the kitchen and asked Mrs. Ruddle if she might have a cup of tea. Mrs. Ruddle made her tea and sat with her at the kitchen table, and neither of them said anything for quite a long time. Chapter 4. The doctor said. The sale did proceed on Saturday, as Dr. Fenwick had predicted. The long case clock went for £85 to a buyer from Cheltenham, which Frances Caldecott noted without expression. The Hepplewhite chairs went for £240, which was above estimate. Tortoiseshell case in the blue bedroom went for £6 to a private buyer who did not look at it very carefully. Lot 312, bound correspondence, went to a Miss J. Marple of St. Mary Mead for £3.15, which was somewhat above what she had been prepared to pay, and she felt the auctioneer had noticed her interest. Correspondence included a set of letters she was fairly sure had been lent to Colonel Caldecott by her cousin Aubrey in 1931. She intended to examine them properly before she decided what to do. She stayed at the Wentford Arms for the weekend. The hotel was adequate. Boiled fish at dinner was not. On Sunday afternoon she was sitting in the small lounge with her knitting and the auction catalogue, which she was reading with methodical attention, when young Mr. Beale, the porter, sat down in the chair across from her. He looked as if he had been carrying something heavy for 2 days and was not sure where to put it down. "You were there Thursday, weren't you?" he said, "at the preview." "I was," Miss Marple said. "I found him, Mr. Petch." "I know, I'm sorry. That must have been very unpleasant for you." Quiet for a moment. The doctor said it was his heart. "So I understand." "Only," Beale said, and stopped. He looked at his hands. I went back in that room on Friday morning to carry the lots out for viewing, and there was a cigarette packet on the windowsill, half open, and I went to move it, and one of the others, Len, said not to touch it because the police had been, and the doctor had been, and nobody had said anything about the cigarettes, and he thought it ought to be left. So we left it. And then, Miss Marple said, and then on Friday afternoon Mr. Hargreave from accounts at Hobbs and Hobbs, Aldrich, picked it up and took a cigarette from it because there was nobody about, and by Friday evening he was poorly. Very poorly. They took him to the cottage hospital. He's all right now, they say. But the doctor there, not Dr. Fenwick, a different doctor. She said it wasn't any kind of heart trouble. It was something else. She sent for the police. Miss Marple set her knitting down on her knee. When did this come known? Yesterday. Saturday, after the sale. Police came and took the cigarette packet away. There were 5 cigarettes left in it. I don't know which one Mr. Petch smoked. The third, Miss Marple said. Beale looked at her. How do you know that? I don't, strictly speaking, she said. But if I were concealing something in a packet of cigarettes, and I wanted it to reach a particular person, I would want the first 2 to be taken by other people beforehand, to remove suspicion from the packet. The third would be the one. Did the police speak with everyone who was at the preview on Thursday? I think so. There's a detective inspector come down from Dorchester, Inspector Harrow. He's young. He seems very thorough. Good, Miss Marple said. She picked her knitting up again. Mr. Beale, one thing, the cigarette packet. Did you see where it came from? Or who brought it into the drawing room? Beale thought about it. I noticed it, because we'd cleared that table ourselves in the morning, and there was nothing on it. Mr. Tench was in the drawing room around that time. So was the lady in the brown coat, the one from Marlborough. Mrs. Vane, Miss Marple said. Yes, there were 2 other people, but I don't know their names. They signed the register. Yes, Miss Marple said. They would have done. She looked down at her knitting. A dropped stitch, 3 rows back. She had known it was there and left it because she had been thinking about something else. She unpicked back to it now carefully, because a stitch that looked like a small mistake could pull the whole thing out of true if you left it long enough. Chapter 5. Miss Marple looks at the library. Inspector Harrow was 29, which Miss Marple gathered from his manner rather than any declaration. He had the competence of a person who has been told he is good at his job, and has decided to live up to it, which is not at all the same thing as having been doing it long enough to be good at it without trying, polite to her, in the way that a young man is polite to an elderly woman he does not consider relevant. She had asked, through Mr. Beale, whether she might speak with him. He had agreed to see her at Brackenhurst Hall on Monday morning, meant he was thorough enough to return to the scene, and open-minded enough to listen to an old woman he had never heard of. She walked up the drive from the village at 10 o'clock. The crocuses had taken another frost over the weekend, and were now mostly brown. The house looked different without the preview visitors, larger and emptier, and somehow surprised to be so. Harrow met her in the entrance hall. He had a constable with him who was there to take notes, and who looked at Miss Marple with the polite blankness of someone who has learned not to ask questions about the arrangements his superior makes. Miss Marple, Harrow said, I understand you were at the preview on Thursday. I was. I had come to look at lots 312 through 318, the bound correspondence. I had a personal interest in some of the material. She looked around the hall. The long case clock was gone. The gap it had left oddly conspicuous, like a pulled tooth. I would like, if I may, to ask you 1 or 2 questions about the cigarette packet. I'm not in a position to share details of an ongoing inquiry, Harrow said. No, of course not. I meant to ask rather than to be told. Inspector, do you know yet what the substance in the cigarette was? He looked at her for a moment. The preliminary analysis suggests aconitine, aconite. It's a plant derivative, monkshood, highly toxic in concentrated form, absorbed through mucous membrane rapidly. Yes, Miss Marple said. A garden plant. Any competent gardener grows it. It comes up reliably, and it's quite pretty in flower. She paused. The person who prepared the cigarette would need access to the plant, some knowledge of extraction, and enough time alone to do the work. It is not something you do on an impulse. No, Harrow agreed. He was watching her with more attention now. May I see the library? She said. The library still had its lots in it, the sale not having reached the library lots on Saturday. The books in their sets, the boxes of correspondence, the natural history volumes in their cases, and on the north wall the Dutch picture. Miss Marple crossed to it and stood in front of it for a moment. It was a canal scene, small oil on panel. The paint cracked in the upper right corner in the way that very old paint cracks when a room is, alternately heated and cold over many decades. The catalogue entry was pinned on a card beneath it. Dutch school unsigned, oil on panel, C 1680, estimated 12 to 20 pounds. That estimate seems low to me, she said, though I am not an expert. Inspector, during your interviews with the preview visitors, did anyone identify this picture by name? By the painter's name, I mean, rather than just as a Dutch picture. Harrow looked at the constable, who checked his notes. One person said it was a nice piece, mister. Tench asked whether there had been any expert opinion on the attribution. And Mrs. Vane? She said nothing about it that was recorded. Miss Marple looked at the picture a moment longer. When I spoke with Mrs. Vane briefly on Thursday afternoon, she referred to it as the Van der Heyden. Not the Dutch picture, not the canal scene. The Van der Heyden. She turned from it. There is no label on this painting. The catalogue says only Dutch school. The attribution to Jan van der Heyden, if there is one, is not public knowledge. Harrow said she might have known from the catalogue. The catalogue says Dutch school, she said van der Heyden. Those are two different things. A woman who knows the attribution knows it, because she has encountered this painting before, or she has encountered the attribution in the trade records. Miss Marple moved to the window, and the trade record for a Van der Heyden attribution made in 1938 would lead you to a London gallery. Not a Wiltshire shop. Harrow was quiet for a moment. You're saying Mrs. Vane was in the London trade in 1938, I am saying. She appears to know something she should not know. If she is only what she presents herself to be, I think it would be worth looking carefully at who Mrs. D. Vane of Marlborough was, before she was. Mrs. Vane of Marlborough. Miss Marple picked up her bag. I don't wish to take up more of your time. I only wanted to point to the picture. The rest is your work entirely. She walked to the door. At the threshold she stopped. Inspector, the packet had 10 cigarettes. One was smoked, one was taken by Mr. Hargreave, that leaves 8, or rather 7 untouched, and 1 partially used. If only the third was prepared, the others are ordinary cigarettes, but I would still be very careful about the packet as evidence. Whoever prepared it with considerable care. They would have been unlikely to leave fingerprints. We haven't found any, Harrow said. No, Miss Marple said. I didn't think you would have. Chapter 6. The cigarette packet. The cigarette packet. The question of the cigarette packet occupied Miss Marple through Monday afternoon. Packet itself was a standard brand, sold in every tobacconist in England. The cigarettes were a standard length and weight. Whoever had brought it in had bought it, or an identical one, at any shop in any town, and decanted the contents and prepared the third cigarette, and placed everything, and brought it to Brackenhurst in a coat pocket or a bag without anyone knowing what it was, because it looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like. This was not amateur work. The aconitine preparation required either some chemical knowledge or, more probably, a patience with research. Instructions were available, few knew where to look, in older texts. Miss Marple thought of old Dr. Clemence's library in St. Mary Mead, which had contained 3 volumes on botanical poisons, because he had written a paper on the subject in 1921. Knowledge was not rare if you were willing to sit with it long enough. The more telling question was how the killer had expected the cigarette to reach Petch specifically. Petch was a pipe man. Everyone who knew him at all knew that. His assistant Iris Dunmore had mentioned it to the constable in passing as a settled fact about her employer. The killer had known it too, which meant the killer knew Petch well enough to know his habits. And yet a pipe man will sometimes take a cigarette at a social moment, the auction preview, with its atmosphere of careful display and commerce, precisely the sort of occasion where a man who usually smoked a pipe might accept a cigarette from a packet left on a table, partly from sociability and partly because a pipe is cumbersome to fill in a cold room. The killer had counted on the setting as much as the poison. But there was another layer. The packet had to reach the drawing room side table without being obviously placed there by the killer. If Mrs. Vane had walked into the drawing room and set a packet of cigarettes on the side table in full view of 3 people, the packet would be remembered as hers. Instead, it had appeared, as things in busy rooms appear, without clear parentage. Miss Marple thought of the Mothers' Union bring, and by in St. Mary Mead 3 years past, where someone had left a seed cake on the trestle table. And nobody could later say who had brought it, because everyone had been milling about, and everyone had something in their hands. A preview was exactly like that. Everyone carried something, catalogues, notebooks, rolled up measurements of tape. A woman putting a small packet on a side table in passing would not be remembered unless someone was specifically watching for it. Howard Tench had apparently been in the drawing room around the time the packet appeared. He had also, according to Beale's later statement to Inspector Harrow, picked the packet up at some point and offered it around before Petch came down from stairs. This was the detail that looked most like guilt. Harrow had been thinking so. Miss Marple could tell from the way he had asked about Tench twice in their conversation, without seeming to. But Tench passing the packet around was, she thought, precisely what you would want if you were someone else. If Mrs. Vane had placed the packet, then Tench's handling of it distributed his fingerprints, transferred the last visible memory of the packet from whoever had placed it to Tench's innocent fingers, and ensured that at least 1 or 2 other people had declined the cigarettes before Petch arrived. The second and third cigarettes would have the clean history of a packet passed freely around a room. Petch, arriving, would have seen a nearly full packet that several people had already touched without consequence. He had taken the third. Miss Marple put this line of thought away for now, and considered instead what she actually knew about Mrs. Dorothea Vane. She knew the woman was 50 or thereabouts. She had been in the London antique trade at some point before 1938, close enough to the trade to know a private attribution to Van der Heyden on a piece that was listed in the public catalogue only as Dutch school. She had come to Brackenhurst specifically, given that she had driven from Marlborough, which was not around the corner, Port. She had registered without apparent recognition from Petch, which meant either that Petch had not noticed her name in the register, or that he had not known what name to look for. A woman who had been in the London trade in 1938 under a different name. A married name was the obvious answer. Vane was the married name. There had been a Mr. Vane, presumably. The name before Vane was the name from the trade. Miss Marple thought about the perfume. She had been standing near Mrs. Vane for perhaps 4 minutes in the corridor outside the library on Thursday afternoon, when Mrs. Vane had come out, and they had both stepped back to allow one of the porters through with a cabinet. The scent had been French, very good, the sort of thing sold in a small number of London shops and almost nowhere else, the sort of scent a woman buys when she knows exactly what she is doing and why. The woman who ran a curio shop in Marlborough bought her scent in London. She came to estate sales in distant counties. She knew the attribution of unsigned Dutch pictures. There was a gap between the surface and what was underneath it, like the crack in the paint of the Van der Heyden on the library wall. You would not see it unless you stood close and knew what you were looking for. Miss Marple wrote a letter to her friend Mrs. Bantry that evening, which was not about the case at all. It was about the daffodils coming up in Mrs. Bantry's garden, and a recipe for ginger biscuits that Miss Marple had found wanting and was thinking of adjusting. She sealed it, addressed it, set it on the writing desk to post in the morning. She was tired. She was also quite certain she was right about the perfume. Tiredness was the problem. She could not afford to be wrong. Chapter 7. 3 conversations before lunch, Tuesday morning. Pale wash of sun that did nothing for the temperature. Miss Marple had 3 conversations before she went in to lunch. First was with Iris Dunmore, in the lounge of the Wentford Arms at 9 o'clock, coffee that the hotel had made with more goodwill than skill. Iris was still at the hotel, because the police had asked her to remain in Wentford for the time being, and because, Miss Marple suspected, she had nowhere pressing to go. She had the look of someone whose ordinary life had been temporarily suspended by a fact she had not yet finished absorbing. He wasn't an easy man to work for, Iris said. She held her cup in both hands. He was demanding, and sometimes he said things without thinking about whether they would hurt. But he knew his work. He genuinely knew it. There are not many people in the trade who can look at a piece of furniture and be right about it. Consistently. He was right consistently. How long had you worked with him? 4 years. I came to him from a firm in Cambridge. He said at the interview that he didn't expect gratitude and he didn't offer sentiment. And if I was the sort of person who needed encouragement, I should go back to Cambridge. I stayed. Did he have enemies? Miss Marple asked. In the trade, I mean. Iris set her cup down. He had people who disliked him. He'd written a letter to the trade press about Tench 2 years ago. About a valuation that Tench hadn't got wrong honestly, anyway. Tench was furious. They'd been in the same room twice since then and not spoken. She paused. And there was the Hartley business, but that was years ago, before the war. What was the Hartley business? I don't know the details. He mentioned it once, in passing. Said there had been a partnership that went wrong, and that he'd been the one who had to deal with the consequences. He didn't say more than that, and I didn't ask. Miss Marple thanked her for the coffee and left her sitting there. The second conversation was with Howard Tench, whom she met by accident outside the post office, which was the sort of accident that happens when you know a person is likely to walk a certain way at a certain time, and you arrange to be walking the same way. Tench was short-tempered. He had not slept well, and he had been asked questions by the police that he found insulting, and he said so, Miss Marple, who had introduced herself as a fellow preview visitor. The implication, he said, standing on the pavement with his briefcase under his arm, was that because Petch and I had a professional disagreement, I am now a person of interest in his death. It's absurd. Yes, I passed the cigarette packet round the room. I didn't know it was poisoned, obviously. Picked it up because it was there. Did you notice who had placed it there? No. I assumed someone had put it down and forgotten it. It happens at previews. People have their hands full. He shifted the briefcase. I had no reason to wish Petch anything worse than professional embarrassment. The letter he wrote about me to the trade press was actionable, in my opinion, but my solicitor disagreed. Had you met Mr. Petch socially, outside the trade? Never. The man was not social. He had his assistant, his notebook, and his opinions. That was Gerald Petch entire. He looked at her. Are you a dealer, Miss Marple? No, she said. I'm a retired lady from a village in Dorset. I find auctions interesting. Tench made a sound that was not quite a laugh and walked on. Third conversation was with Mrs. Ruddle at Brackenhurst Hall, where Miss Marple went on the pretext of inquiring whether the library lots had been collected yet. They had not. She sat in the kitchen while Mrs. Ruddle made tea with the competence of someone who had made tea in that kitchen 4,000 times and had no plans to stop. Mrs. Ruddle, Miss Marple said, do you remember a business partnership Mr. Petch had before the war with a woman? I believe it was a gallery of some kind. Mrs. Ruddle set the teapot down. I don't know anything about Mr. Petch's business. I never met him before Thursday. No, but this house has been in the antique business in a small way for 30 years. The Colonel bought and sold occasionally. I thought you might have heard the name Petch in connection with the Colonel's early purchases. Mrs. Ruddle thought. There was a gallery called Petch and Hartley. I remember because the Colonel bought a writing table from them in 46. After the war, just the one name by then Petch, not Hartley. Petch and Hartley, Miss Marple said. They had a good name, good stock. Mrs. Ruddle poured the tea. I don't know anything about a Hartley. The Colonel never mentioned one. No, Miss Marple said. I don't suppose he would have. The Hartley half was a woman, I believe. And she had been out of the picture by the time the Colonel bought his writing table. Mrs. Ruddle put a biscuit on the saucer without being asked, because she could see Miss Marple was cold. How out of the picture? Prison? Miss Marple said simply. And then marriage, and then a shop in Wiltshire. She drank some tea. Her maiden name was Hartley. Married name is Vane. Mrs. Ruddle looked at her over the rim of her own cup. The woman in the brown coat? Yes. They sat quietly for a moment. Somewhere in the house a door settled in its frame with a low crack, the way old houses do when the temperature drops. She came a long way, Mrs. Ruddle said. From Marlborough. She came further than that, Miss Marple said. She came from 1939. Chapter 8. Wrong Perfume Inspector Harrow came to Miss Marple's hotel table at 7:30 on Tuesday evening. He sat down without ceremony, which she took as a good sign. A young man who pulls out a chair and sits in it without waiting to be invited is a young man who has decided you are talking to. We looked into the Hartley connection, he said. Petch and Hartley, gallery on the Fulham Road, ran from 1935 to 1939. Dorothy Hartley, co-proprietor. In 1939 she was arrested for handling stolen goods. A Dutch painting of disputed provenance. She was convicted and served 14 months at Holloway. He paused. The provenance dispute centred on whether she had known the piece was stolen. Counsel argued she had not. The prosecution produced correspondence suggesting otherwise. Gerald Petch gave evidence for the prosecution. Miss Marple looked at him. He said, Harrow continued, that Miss Hartley had made the purchase independently and without his knowledge. When he became aware of the dubious provenance, he had urged her to return the piece, and she had refused. He said he had then felt obliged to report the situation. The inspector had the tone of a man reading something he finds unpersuasive. The correspondence the prosecution produced was described as letters between Miss Hartley and a dealer on the continent. Petch supplied these letters. And did anyone inquire into how Mr. Petch had come to have them? Not on record. He was treated as a witness, acting on conscience. The gallery was dissolved. Petch re-established himself under his own name. Within 2 years, he had Miss Hartley's client list, and a good part of her stock, prices that were reasonable given that she was not in a position to negotiate. "Miss Hartley," Miss Marple said. Hartley was her name in the trade. Was it her family name or a married name? Birth name? She married in 1942. A Mr. Vane, an army officer, killed in 44. She kept the name, and she has been in Marlborough since 1946. Respectable small trade. Member of the local horticultural society for 12 years. He looked at her. Monkshood is one of the plants listed on her entry form for the local flower show. "There," Miss Marple said. "We can place her in the house. We can place her near the drawing room. We cannot yet establish that she placed the cigarette packet." He leaned back. "Tench handled it. 3 other people handled it before Petch. But none of them were poisoned," Miss Marple said. "Because the 3rd cigarette was the prepared one. If the 1st and 2nd people had taken the 3rd cigarette, they would be dead. The killer was not trying to poison everyone who touched the packet. She was trying to poison Petch specifically. And she arranged the packet so that he would take the 3rd cigarette and not the 1st or 2nd. How could she arrange that? She put the packet on a table in a room where people were circulating. She knew that dealers at previews are sociable at the right moment and more cautious at other moments. Packet left on a common surface is picked up and passed around. In my experience of church bring and buy sales, items left freely on tables are touched by several people before any one person takes them. She needed 2 people to take cigarettes before Petch did. Petch came to the drawing room late, after the others, because he went up to the blue bedroom in the afternoon. She looked at her hands. I believe she had watched his movements through the morning and knew his pattern. She placed the packet when he was out of the room. She expected that 1 or 2 people would take cigarettes from it by the time he came back. She counted on the social habit of the thing. Harrow was quiet. "Inspector, there is one more matter." Miss Marple folded her hands on the table. "The perfume Mrs. Vane wears is Her Blue, by Guerlain. I know it because an old friend of mine from London wore it for 30 years. It is not sold in Wiltshire. It is available from 1 or 2 London shops and occasionally by post order from a very particular supplier in Bond Street. It is not the sort of perfume a woman buys without knowing exactly what she is buying." She paused. "It is the sort of perfume a woman keeps as a private remnant of a life she used to have. Mrs. Vane of Marlborough has kept one London habit. I found myself thinking about it. And a woman who keeps one luxury from her old life," Miss Marple said. "A woman who has not forgotten who she was. She has been carrying this for 15 years, Inspector. This was not a sudden plan. This was a patient one." Harrow stood. He put his notebook in his pocket. "I am going to apply for a warrant to search Mrs. Vane's shop and premises in Marlborough. If we find evidence of aconitine preparation, or materials consistent with it, I think we will have enough." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "I think you probably will." She watched him go. Psst. The dining room had mostly cleared for the evening, and the waiter was setting the tables for breakfast, turning the cups upside down on their saucers in the way they did at this hotel. It was a small, sensible habit, keeping the dust off the rim. She thought about Dorothy Hartley in 1939, standing in a courtroom while Gerald Petch told the court what she had done. She thought about 14 months at Holloway. She thought about coming out to find your name gone and your stock sold, and the man who had destroyed you living comfortably on the proceeds. She did not feel sorry for Petch, exactly, but she would feel sorry for no one's death, because that was not how she was made. Chapter 9. What Mrs. Ruddle remembered. The search of Mrs. Vane's premises in Marlborough was carried out on Wednesday morning. Miss Marple knew this because Harrow told her on Tuesday night before he drove back to Dorchester, and because she was sufficiently experienced with how these things worked to know that a day would pass before she heard anything further. She spent Wednesday in an unusual state of not knowing what to do with herself. She walked to the market, bought a pound of apples and a skein of green wool she did not need, ate lunch at the hotel with her library catalogue, and a novel she was not getting on with, and in the afternoon walked to Brackenhurst Hall again. Not for a reason particularly, simply preferred to be in a place where something had happened rather than a place where nothing was happening. Mrs. Ruddle was in the kitchen as usual. Francis Caldecott was in the study, dealing with correspondence. The house had the hollow quality of a place that has been sold and not yet vacated, furniture shapes still visible on the walls, where pictures had hung, gaps on shelves, the impression of things in the dust, on surfaces where things had stood. "I've been thinking," Mrs. Ruddle said, when Miss Marple sat down at the kitchen table. "Yes, about Thursday, the day of the preview. I've been through it in my head." Miss Marple waited, about 10 to 3. Mrs. Ruddle said carefully, as if laying down a set of objects in a particular order, took the tea trolley into the drawing-room. Mr. Petch took a cup and Mr. Tench didn't want one. And there were 2 other people looking at the bookcase. The lady in the brown coat wasn't in the drawing-room at that point. She'd been in there earlier around 2, and she'd gone out. "Out of the room?" "Out of the room, yes. I saw her go into the corridor. Now, psst. When I brought the trolley in at 10 to 3, there was nothing on the side table. Cleared it myself that morning. And there was nothing on it when I came in with the trolley." She paused. "When I took the trolley back out at about 3:05, the cigarette packet was there. I noticed it because I'd just cleared that table. I assumed one of the visitors had set it down." "Did you see who?" "I didn't see who put it there. But I did see, when I went through the hall with the trolley, that the lady in the brown coat was coming down the stairs." She looked at Miss Marple steadily, from upstairs, not from the library, not from the corridor. From upstairs, Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. Was she carrying anything? A bag, the sort of bag women carry to sales, the larger kind, for catalogues and measurements and so on. She had it on her arm. I didn't think anything of it. "No, you wouldn't. It's the ordinary thing." Miss Marple looked at the table. "Mrs. Ruddle, what had been upstairs between 2 o'clock and 3? Viewing was open to the whole house, including the bedrooms. Several people were up there. Mr. Petch went up later, at about 3:30, which is when She stopped. "Yes. The lady in the brown coat would have known the house layout," Mrs. Ruddle said. "Anyone who'd been here an hour would. The blue bedroom was the room at the end of the east corridor, clearly marked with a lock card on the door. If she'd been upstairs, she'd have been through that corridor. She would have known the cold of the room," Miss Marple said. "A cold room, and an overcoat, and a pipeman who might take a cigarette on a grey afternoon in a dratty house." She had prepared for this very carefully. Mrs. Ruddle got up and put the kettle on, because it was what you did when you needed a moment. When she came back to the table, she said, "She'd been planning it a long time, hadn't she? I think so. Not necessarily this specific auction, but the opportunity of being in the same place as him, at a preview, where movement is natural, and everyone carries things, and no one is paid much attention. That kind of opportunity, when it arose, she was ready for it. Do you think what he did to her was as bad as what she did to him?" The kettle began to make its preliminary noise. Miss Marple looked at the window where the garden was visible, the crocuses quite dead now. "What he did to her was deliberate," she said. "He reported her for a crime he had set up himself. He used her prison sentence to take everything she had built. She lost her name, her business, place in the trade, and nearly 2 years of her life. She was quiet for a moment. What she did to him was also deliberate, and he is dead, and she will go to prison for it. She looked at Mrs. Ruddle. I don't know how to weigh those two things against each other. I'm not sure anyone can. The law doesn't try to. No, Mrs. Ruddle said. She made the tea. I suppose it doesn't. They sat together in the kitchen, while the afternoon light came through the window at a low angle, particular light of March, when the sun gets above the line of the trees, but barely. The kettle was warm between them on the table. Later, walking back down the drive, Miss Marple thought about Harrow's warrant and the search of the Marlborough premises and the way evidence accumulated, piece by piece, like a picture that makes no sense until you are close enough to see that it is a picture at all. She thought about the Vander Hayden on the library wall, still unsold, the crack in the paint unchanged. Chapter 10. Vander Hayden Harrow telephoned the Wentford Arms at 8 o'clock on Wednesday evening. We found a mortar and pestle in the outbuilding behind the shop, he said. Stone, with residue. The laboratory is looking at it now. We also found a copy of a text on botanical toxicology, published 1903, with several pages marked with pencil in the section on aconitine, and we found a receipt from a seed supplier for monkshood bulbs 2 years old, consistent with a plant mature enough to provide material this March. The garden, Miss Marple said. She has a garden behind the shop, about 40 feet long, well kept. The monkhood is in the south-facing bed, 6 plants, well established. Yes, I am also now in possession of records from the Public Record Office, Harrow said, confirming that a Dorothy Margaret Hartley of the Petches and Hartley Gallery, Fulham Road, was convicted in October 1939 of knowingly handling stolen goods, sentenced to 18 months, served 14. The stolen goods in question were a small oil panel attributed to Jan Vander Hayden. Miss Marple sat down on the edge of the bed. The telephone flex was not quite long enough to reach the chair. The painting, she said. Painting in the Brackenhurst Library is not the same painting, Harrow said. I have checked. One in the 1939 case was recovered and returned to its Dutch owners in 1946. The Brackenhurst painting is a different work by the same artist, or attributed to him. But Hartley, as she was then, would have known the attribution of the Brackenhurst piece, because the private record of that attribution was produced during her trial as comparative evidence. The prosecution brought in a Vander Hayden expert, who also referenced the Brackenhurst piece as another example of the artist's work. She would have heard that in court. And she never forgot it, Miss Marple said. Apparently not. Miss Marple thought about that for a moment. A woman sitting in a dock in 1939, listening to an expert witness, talking about a painting in a Dorset house, filing the information away in some part of her mind that kept things for later, because later might be useful. When will you speak with her? Tomorrow morning, Harrow said. I want the laboratory results first. If the residue confirms aconitine, we have the connection from the plant to the preparation. Combined with the witness, placing her on the stairs before the cigarette packet appeared, the Vander Hayden knowledge, and the prison connection to Petch, I think we have enough to make an arrest. She will not deny the motive, Miss Marple said. She may deny the act, but she will not say that what Petch did to her was nothing. It was not nothing. Whether the jury decides that mitigates anything is another matter. It isn't my job to decide what mitigates what. No, quite right. It isn't mine either. After she put the telephone down, she sat on the bed for a while longer than she intended. The room was quiet. Outside, the Wentford High Street had put itself to bed early, as market towns do on a Wednesday. She thought about Dorothy Hartley in 1939, 28 or 29 years old. She would have been standing in the dock at the Old Bailey or wherever they had tried her. She thought about 14 months at Holloway and coming out in 1941 into a country at war, and finding that Gerald Petch had used the time constructively. She thought about 1942, a marriage to a soldier who would be dead in France in 2 years. She thought about 1946, shop in Marlborough, starting again with what you had left, and the name you had borrowed from the dead. She thought about 12 years of the Horticultural Society, and the monk's hood in the south-facing bed, and the mortar and pestle in the outbuilding. Patience was one word for it. Another word was cold. A third word, and perhaps the most accurate, was purpose. Dorothy Vane, as she was now, had not spent 12 years in unrelenting rage. She had lived her life. She had waited for the right occasion. When the Brackenhurst Hall catalogue came across her desk with Petch's name in the preview advance list, she had read it with the attention of someone who had been preparing for this for a long time and recognised the moment when it arrived. Preview was the right occasion because of the movement, the anonymity, the cold rooms and the sociability. She had been at previews for years. She knew how they worked. Miss Marple got up from the bed and washed her face and hands and went to sit in the chair by the window. She had her knitting. She did not do any knitting. She sat and watched the street and thought about whether a person who has been comprehensively wronged by another person and who plans their revenge with patience and intelligence and carries it out cleanly is more or less frightening than a person who kills in a moment of anger. She decided they were frightening in different ways. She also decided this was not the sort of thought she would share with Inspector Harrow, who was young and thorough, and doing his job correctly, and did not need an old woman from Dorset offering reflections on the varieties of frightening. She went to bed at 10. She slept better than she expected. Chapter 11. 4 days to the laboratory. The auctions clerk, Mr. Gerald Oakes, was a neat man of about 40 who kept the Hobbs and Aldrich daybook in a hand, so precise it looked typeset, and who had been helpful to everyone at the preview, because it was his professional disposition to be helpful, and who had been quietly appalled by the events of the last 5 days. In a way he showed only by drinking more tea than usual. Miss Marple encountered him in the Hobbs and Aldrich office on Thursday morning, where she had gone to inquire about the collection of her library lots. The lots were available for collection. He filled in the paperwork. She paid the outstanding amount, which was 14 shillings, after the £3 15 shillings bid. He made her a receipt. "Terrible business," he said, as he blotted it. "Mr. Petch. I've dealt with him at previews 3 or 4 times over the years. He could be difficult, but he knew his stock. You don't often find both." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "Has Inspector Harrow spoken with everyone from the preview? Do you know?" "Believe so. I was interviewed myself on Monday. I told him what I could, which wasn't much. I was in the study most of Thursday afternoon, going over the catalogue corrections with Mr. Aldrich." He handed her the receipt. "I did tell him one thing I thought might be useful. Whether it was or not, I don't know." "Oh?" He hesitated. In his professional life, Mr. Oakes did not gossip. But this was a murder inquiry, or what appeared to be one. And the line between information and gossip was clearer to him than to most people. At about 2:20 on Thursday afternoon, he said, "I came out of the study to find a catalogue in the hall table drawer. Mrs. Vane was in the corridor. She was coming from the direction of the back stairs, the servants' stairs. Not the main staircase." Miss Marple looked at him. "The servants' stairs come down into the east corridor, which runs past the blue bedroom," he said. "Didn't think anything of it at the time. Preview visitors sometimes find the back stairs and use them. They're perfectly accessible. But after everything that happened, I mentioned it to the inspector." "You were right to do so," Miss Marple said. Mr. Oakes, did Mrs. Vane see you? I don't know. She was walking away from me. She went into the kitchen passage. I went to the hall table, and this was 2:20, approximately. The receipt was in her bag. The lots would be sent to St. Mary Mead by carrier. She thanked him and walked out into the Thursday morning, which was cold and had a wind in it that had not been there on Monday. The trap, she had decided, had to be laid that day. If the laboratory came back with confirmation, Harrow would move to make the arrest, and an arrest. Without a clear account of how the cigarette had reached the drawing room, was an arrest that a careful solicitor might unpick. What they needed was for Mrs. Vane to confirm, in some way that the police could use, that she knew about the evidence being examined. She thought about this as she walked back toward the hotel. A woman who had prepared carefully and waited 12 years and executed the thing cleanly would not panic easily. She was not the sort of woman who panicked, but even careful people, when told that physical evidence is being examined, make a calculation. They decide whether to stay or go, whether to carry on as if nothing has happened, or remove themselves from the vicinity before the results come in. Mrs. Vane was still in Wentford. She had not yet collected her lots from the sale. She was staying at a small bed and breakfast on the far side of the high street. Harrow knew this. Miss Marple went to the hotel telephone and asked the operator for Inspector Harrow's number at the Dorchester police station. She was put through after 4 minutes. "Inspector," she said, "I would like to suggest something. I am aware that the laboratory results on the mortar residue will take several days. I wonder whether it would be useful if Mrs. Vane were to hear, from a source she has no reason to distrust, that the laboratory analysis has been expedited and the results are expected within 24 hours. Harrow was quiet for a moment. "You're suggesting we let her believe the net is closing faster than it is?" "I'm suggesting that a woman who is currently deciding whether to collect her auction lots or simply leave Wentford might make that decision differently if she thought she had less time. And if she runs, that tells us something. It tells us what we already know, but it tells it in a way that a jury can understand." Another pause. How would this information reach her? "The auctioneer's clerk," Miss Marple said. "Mr. Oakes. He is a respectable man who speaks to everyone, because it is his job to. If he were to mention in Mrs. Vane's hearing that he had heard the police laboratory was expediting the analysis of the evidence from Brackenhurst, because the case had been elevated in priority, I think Mrs. Vane would hear it. And do you think she'd run? I think she would know that the laboratory will eventually confirm the aconitine residue in her mortar. I think she knows that Mr. saw her in the East Corridor on Thursday afternoon. I think she is a practical woman who has been practical about everything connected with this case, and that a practical woman, when the walls are coming in, removes herself." Miss Marple paused. "She will go early in the morning, I think, before the business day. She will leave the lots behind, which she will regret, but which she will consider acceptable. If I have someone on the Marlborough Road," Harrow said slowly. "She drove here," Miss Marple said. "A dark green Morris, I believe. She would take the Marlborough Road west." Chapter 12. The road at 7 in the morning. Mr. Oakes had not liked being asked to carry false information. He had said so to Harrow, plainly, and Harrow had said the information was not entirely false. The laboratory process had in fact been prioritised, of course, and what Oakes would say was accurate in substance, if not in timing. Oakes had thought about this for a moment, and then agreed. He mentioned it to Mrs. Vane that afternoon, at the Hobbs and Aldrich office, when she came in to confirm her collection arrangements. But he said it in the course of a general conversation about the unhappy events of the week, piece of public information, Winkin that had filtered down from the police inquiry. He said, The inspector had told him personally that the laboratory analysis of certain materials found in a Susk's premises had been placed at the top of the queue. Mrs. Vane had thanked him for the information. Her voice was level, her hands were in her coat pockets. She asked whether her lots could be dispatched to Marlborough by carrier rather than collected, and Oakes said yes, they could be arranged for Monday. She said that would be convenient. She left. The constable, who was watching the bed and breakfast from across the street, at 6:45 the next morning saw the light go on in her room at 5:10. The dark green Morris was loaded by 6:20. She drove west out of Wentford at 6:31. Harrow had put a uniformed constable and a sergeant in an unmarked car at the junction of the Marlborough Road and the lane to Fenwick Cross, 4 miles west of Wentford. They stopped the Morris at 6:42. Mrs. Dorothea Vane was arrested on suspicion of the murder of Gerald Petch and the attempted murder of a second person by means of a poisoned cigarette. She was cautioned. She was taken to Dorchester. She did not speak in the car. The sergeant, who wrote up his notes afterward, said, "She sat in the back seat and looked out of the window at the hedgerows going past and did not seem surprised." At Dorchester, after she had been charged, and before she was taken to a cell, she asked to speak to a solicitor. While she waited, she said one thing to the desk sergeant, who wrote it down because he had been told to write down anything she said. She said, "He put me in prison for a crime he committed himself. I want that to be on record." The desk sergeant wrote it down. Miss Marple heard about the arrest at 9 o'clock that morning from Harrow, who telephoned the hotel. She was eating breakfast when the call came, and she went back to the dining room afterward and finished her toast, because the toast was there, and she was cold. And there was nothing else to do about any of it now. The newspaper on Friday carried a brief item on the inside pages. Police arrest Wiltshire dealer in connection with auction death. Detective Inspector Harrow, of the Dorset Constabulary, was reported as saying that the arrest was the result of careful investigation, and that charges had been formally laid. There was no mention of estate auctions or Dutch paintings or cigarettes, or the 17 years between what Gerald Petch had done in 1939 and what had been done to him in a cold bedroom in March of this year. Francis Caldecott read the paper at breakfast and said nothing. Mrs. Ruddle read it in the kitchen and set it down and went on with the washing up. Howard Tench read it at his hotel in Wentford and felt the particular lightness of a man who has been standing under something heavy and has just been told he may step aside. Iris Dunmore read it in her room and sat for a long time on the edge of the bed, not quite crying, the paper folded in her lap. Miss Marple's library lots arrived at St. Mary Mead the following Tuesday by carrier. 4 bound volumes of correspondence were in good order. She sat at her desk and went through them carefully and found, in the 3rd volume, 6 letters that were unmistakably, in her cousin Aubrey's hand, addressed to the Colonel and dated 1928 through 1932. She wrote to the solicitors handling the estate. They replied within the week acknowledging the claim. The letters were returned to her cousin Aubrey in April. It was, in its small way, the thing that had been set right. Chapter 13, after the sale. The trial of Dorothy Margaret Vane, formerly Hartley, took place at the Dorset Assizes in June. Miss Marple did not attend. She read the newspaper reports over her morning tea and found them moderately accurate. Prosecution established the connection between the defendant and the victim through the 1939 trial records. It established the means through the laboratory analysis of the mortar residue, which confirmed aconitine at concentrations inconsistent with domestic gardening and consistent with deliberate extraction. It established opportunity through the testimony of Mr. Oakes and Mrs. Ruddle, who gave their evidence clearly. Defence argued that the 1939 conviction represented a profound injustice, for which the defendant had paid an enormous price, and that Gerald Petch's character ought to weigh in the jury's assessment of the case. The judge directed the jury that the character of the victim, however relevant to the question of motive, was not a defence to the charge. Mrs. Vane was convicted of murder and sentenced accordingly. She did not, so far as Miss Marple could tell from the newspaper, show any particular expression when the verdict was read. Report said she stood quietly and listened and was taken below. The matter of Petch's testimony in 1939 was raised briefly during the trial and then set aside, as such things tend to be when the person who gave the false testimony is no longer available to be questioned. A journalist from a trade publication wrote a short article about it afterwards, noting that the provenance records of the 1939 Dutch painting and the circumstances of Dorothy Hartley's conviction presented questions that had never been satisfactorily answered. The article was not widely read. Iris Dunmore took over the Petch business as the will provided. She had not known she was in the will. She had read it in a solicitor's office in Bloomsbury on a Tuesday afternoon in April, sitting across from a man who read it to her in a voice that suggested he had read wills to surprise people many times, and had developed a style appropriate to the occasion. The trade was initially cautious. Gerald Petch had not been popular, and his assistant was an unknown quantity. But in May, a letter arrived from an elderly collector in Kensington named Mr. Aldous Brent, who had dealt with Petch for 12 years in a relationship of mutual dissatisfaction. Mr. Brent wrote that he had heard, through the usual routes by which such things are heard, that Miss Dunmore was honest and capable, and had managed the business through a difficult period with notable competence. He wrote that he would be pleased to transfer his custom to her. He was the first. Others followed. Francis Caldecott sold the empty Brackenhurst Hall to a developer who intended to convert it into 6 apartments. The east wing, with the non-functional radiators, would become the ground floor units, which the developer anticipated selling at a modest price given the heating situation. He was not wrong. Mrs. Ruddle retired to a cottage in the village of Stoke Peverell, where her niece lived. She brought with her the Colonel's armchair, which Francis had told her she was welcome to, and which she placed by the window in the sitting-room, where it looked somewhat large for the room. Howard Tench went back to his books in Winchester, and did not think about Gerald Petch any more than he had to. Vander Hayden, in the Brackenhurst Library, was withdrawn from the sale after the auction. Once, the Hobbs and Aldrich partners had re-examined the attribution question in light of the trial evidence and concluded they had been too conservative with their estimate. It was subsequently sold privately to a buyer in London for considerably more than £20. Miss Marple received a postcard from her cousin Aubrey in late April. The letters had arrived safely. He was grateful. He hoped she had not gone to too much trouble. She had not, she wrote back. She had simply been attending to a small matter, and it had come together in the end. The crocuses in her own garden were long over. Daffodils had come and gone. It was nearly summer, which, in St. Mary Mead, meant the garden needed more attention than she had been giving it. She stood at the kitchen window one evening after tea, and looked at the bed where the hostas were coming up, and the roses were not yet in bud, and thought about nothing in particular for quite some time. She was tired in a way that sleep didn't entirely account for. She had been tired like this before, after other cases, and she knew it would pass. It was the weight of it, she thought. Not guilt and not sorrow, exactly. Just the weight of knowing that things which look simple on the outside are almost never simple on the inside, and that you could be right about a person and still find the rightness did not make you glad. She put the kettle on. Outside the window, the garden was very green.